Hi there, in this video we're going to be fitting a new nut to a guitar. Don't worry if you've got a bass because it's the exact same process, so you can still follow this video. So it's of course a fairly straightforward process, but there are a few little things to look out for and a few things to avoid as well. So it's actually fairly common to see even mass-produced factory guitars with improperly fitting nuts. So I'm going to show you how to avoid this, some things to look out for with the fitment, and also I'm going to go through the gluing process as well. So I'm going to show you the glues which you can use and how to apply those glues. So let's get started now. So up on the workbench today is this Gibson SG. This is a 100th anniversary model. So it would have had the writing on the headstock here saying 100th anniversary, but the customer wanted to get rid of that along with the robot tuners. And I've installed this inlay instead and refinished the headstock in some nice glossy lacquer. And it's also had a bit of a tint on the headstock as well, so you can see it's more of an aged look and it matches nicely with the tuners. And a bit closer to the binding as well than this silver mother of pearl would have done. And I've also fitted new tuners on the back instead of the robot ones. But today our focus is going to be on fixing the nut in. So this is a very basic job, it's nothing complicated at all, but there's a few little steps you need to do to get it right. So I'm going to go over those now. So firstly, it's important the nut's already the right size. I've got another video up where you can see how I make a bone nut from scratch. This is actually a Tusq nut on this one, but it's the same process, and you can see how I make sure I get it the right size. That's obviously very important because you don't want it too much over this way so it could catch your hand if it was too long, and if it was too short you'd have a gap on that edge which would look really bad. It's also important it's tight between the fretboard, so in its slot itself. So you can see this will go in nice and easily, but there's absolutely no slot there at all. It won't go backwards and forwards or anything like that. And that's kind of a perfect fit. If you have it too tight, you can actually damage the lacquer on the headstock, forcing it in, because it will end up chipping off just off this edge there, and that will really ruin your day. So before you reach for the glue, it's always a good idea to make sure the nut is seating right, because 9 times out of 10 it won't be. If you've just knocked out a nut out of this, the chances are it'll have left old glue behind, which will prevent the new nut seating properly. So you've got to check the faces here. So there's this face where the fretboard joins it. There's the bottom here which it sits on, and that will nearly always have glue left on, and the front face there. So even if you've got a Fender style headstock, it's the same process. It sits in a slot just like this, just this front face here, where I'm pointing at now, is a little bit taller. And you've got to check that there's nothing preventing the nut sitting nice and tight against all faces. You can see the line as the fretboard joins it is really tight there, that's great, and you can see it's sitting flush on the bottom, and there's no rock in it either. So you can tell there's not a bump in the bottom which would be preventing it sitting all the way along. So this means we've got a good contact across the whole bottom of it. So if you do have some leftover glue in the slot here, my favourite tool for attacking it is a fine chisel like this. So I like the chisel to be a little bit smaller than the nut slot itself, so you don't end up forcing it through there and possibly damaging the lacquer on the face here. You also want to be very careful around the edges, so the bass side and the treble side here, because you don't want to take too much from there, because it'll be very obvious if you do, because you'll have a gap under the nut then, and you can also risk damaging the lacquer at the edges as well. But identify the high spots. Sometimes it's not always easy to see. The glue can be fairly invisible and you can't quite tell, because it only needs a little tiny bit to prevent it seating properly. So to identify them, I'll end up doing multiple test fits of the nut and to see how it's sitting. And I know if it's sitting like, for example, if it was sitting like that angle, I would know there was some glue on this edge here. So then I would do a very light shaving down here and try and identify where the point is. I will also slide the nut along the slot to make sure and see at which point it stops sitting square. Equally important are the surfaces on the nut itself. This is a Tusq nut, and this comes with some nice flat surfaces already, as long as you don't end up sanding those away when you're fitting the nut. So I've kept the bottom as it was. I haven't sanded this at all, so this is straight from the factory, so it's nice and flat. Same as this, you can see it's still got the numbers on, so that's obviously the same as well. And I have actually sanded this side here to make it fit. In an ideal world, it would fit without any kind of sanding, but that hardly ever happens. So this has had just a little minor sanding, and I've made sure to keep this dead flat as I went, so you can check that with a straight edge and see there's no gaps under there. So again, you've got to check that before you glue it in, but that's what we're going to do now. So once you're happy with how the nut's sitting, you can start thinking about gluing it in. There's two main popular options which most people use for the glue. One is Type Bond over here, which is a wood glue, and the other is this, which is medium viscosity super glue. or CA glue. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. So for Titebond, you could look at it as an advantage or a disadvantage, is it's got a longer open time. So this gives you longer to position your nut, which is obviously an advantage, so you can ensure that you're 100% happy with it. But then of course you've got to wait for it to set afterwards. So this can take quite a while, especially over here in the UK where it's not normally very warm. So then you've got to sit waiting, do something else before you can go back to this job. Whereas if you're using super glue, you can just get on with it. The other disadvantage of Titebond is that it's not going to stick so well to the Tusq itself. It'll stick very well to the nut slot, the wood, but it won't stick so well to non-porous surfaces like either bone or Tusq. So it's not quite as secure as super glue either. The main disadvantage with super glue is that it will ruin your finish if you get it on it. So you have to be very careful not to get it anywhere on the finish, especially on nitrocellulose finish like this, because you can't use then acetone to try and remove the glue after, because that will actually also dissolve the finish, which would make a bad situation worse. So I like to use the super glue just because it's a bit quicker, it allows me to finish the job sooner, and also it's a bit more secure, as I mentioned. So how I'll use this to make sure I don't get it on the finish is I will squirt a decent amount onto a board like this. It's just a scrap piece of board, and I'll use a cocktail stick or a toothpick to dip in that, and then I'll apply it to the slot itself rather than the nut. And I'll do it probably a centimetre in on either side and a little bit in the middle as well. You don't want to do too much because it's just going to make it difficult to remove should anyone ever need to in the future, and it just doesn't need much anyway to hold it in place. So we're going to do that now. So here's the nut glued in place. It's nice and solid. It's only been about a minute and the glue's fully hardened, so I can get on with the rest of the guitar now. Now here's the nut, the strings on. So that's this one done now. It's back in its case and ready to be collected. That's all for this one. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions on the process, feel free to leave a comment and I'll be glad to get back to you. And if you've enjoyed the video, please subscribe to see more content like this, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks again.